Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of Anti-Colonial Week lecture series organized by University for Palestine and FI's Forum for Anti-Colonial Inquiry in the Humanities and Social Sciences. My name is Hassan Noah, and I will moderate this evening. It's my great pleasure to open the first lecture in the series of Anti-Colonial Week lectures. This event comes as a natural response to the daily colonial practices we witness in various parts of the world. It is a serious and necessary response by some students and researchers at the University of Vienna to the discursive practices we experience daily in the street, in the educational and academic institutions, in the media, and in decision-making centers, and so on. The Anti-Colonial Week aims to deconstruct the colonial mentality wherever it exists. Unfortunately, this mentality is not confined to a specific geographical regions. Rather, it is a discourse with its own tools, weapons, and language. If this discourse is not confronted by a counter-discourse, scenes of wars, massacres, genocides, and oppression will continue to be an inseparable part of our recurring daily reality. Therefore, we invite you to join your efforts with ours and to work together in seeking what must be done. It was planned for all lectures to be held on the campus, but last Tuesday we were informed from the university that all rooms had been cancelled due to unfounded security concerns and the university's fear of the spread of anti-Semitic narratives. These concerns fall within the realm of suspicions without evidence, and so far not a single piece of proof has been provided to support these false accusations. Now, today's topic is Israel as a settler-colonial state. The term settler-colonial state refers to a type of colonialism where outsiders settle permanently in a land and establish political and social control over the indigenous population. When some scholars or activists describe Israel as a settler-colonial state, they mean that the creation of Israel involved Jewish settlers moving to Palestine, establishing settlements, and building a new state structure that displaced or marginalized the native Palestinian population. This view focuses on the process of settlement, land ownership, and power rather than religion or ethnicity. Others, however, disagree with this interpretation, arguing that Jewish migration to Israel was a return to a historic homeland rather than a colonial project. About that and more, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Ramzy Baroud, joining us online from Rome. I will introduce Dr. Ramzy. Dr. Ramzy Baroud is a Palestinian author, historian, and academic whose work focuses on Palestinian history, liberation, and people's history. He has written 6 books, including Searching Jenin, the Second Palestinian Intifada, My father was a freedom fighter. The last earth. These chains will be broken, and our vision for liberation, co-edited with Ilan Pappé. His forthcoming book, Before the Flood, will be published by Seven Stories Press. Baroud holds a Ph.D. in Palestine Studies from the University of Exeter and has taught mass communication at Curtin University. He is a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center of Islam and Global Affairs, CIGA, at Istanbul Zaim University. His academic contributions extend to numerous books and journals, and he has lectured at leading universities worldwide. His work has been translated into multiple languages. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Dr. Ramzy Baroud. The floor is yours, Dr. Ramzy.
I thank you very much, Hassan, and for this lovely introduction, for the kind invitation, also to Roberta, who led us through this in the beginning, and to everyone who has joined. I think I would like to talk about this from a slightly different point of view. I think it is, the positions of whether Israel is a settler colonial state or not, I think they are kind of well defined in a sense. And honestly, I don't even know if they require a great deal of elucidation. I mean, we know the historical context of Israel being the colonial origins in Israel, the rise of the Zionist movement, the fact that even before Israel was established as a country, or as a state on the ruins of historic Palestine in 1948, for over 50, 60 years, there were that kind of, the settlement process had already started, funded by various European groups. I come from a village called Beit Daras. It's located in southern Palestine. And decades before Israel was established, and Beit Daras, along with over 500 villages, were destroyed and 800,000 people were made stateless and homeless, there was an Israeli, or rather a European Jewish settlement that was established near Beit Daras. They call it Tivu or Taibe, but originally it's the Arabic word Taibe. And the people of Taibe were all immigrants from Europe. And that happened, that settlement was funded by the Rothschild family. And it was built somewhere, I believe, around 1886. So we're not even talking about prior to the first Zionist conference and the kind of the creation of the political discourse around Zionism that led to the creation of Israel. So the colonial, settler colonial elements in Zionism are really should not even be contested. And if they were contested at one point, how is one to explain the displacement of Palestinians in 1948? The idea that was openly explained by Israeli or by Zionist thinkers at the time, that there is no place for two people within that region, leading to the displacement, or the expulsion rather, of a minimum of 700,000, but according to Walid Khalidi and other historians, up to 850,000 Palestinians. That's the vast majority of the population, and the destruction of all of their villages, along with mine, Beit Daras, and the resettlement of all the immigrants coming initially from Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but eventually the Middle East, and ultimately Africa, but also Russia, following the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of that. How is one to explain the settlements, the Jewish-only settlements, the Jewish-only roads, the Jewish-only everything? And just in case anybody is still having some doubts about it, just let's recall what Netanyahu himself said in May 2024, that Israel will maintain absolute control over the area between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, therefore leaving no space for even Palestinians living in these pockets, these Bantustans in the West Bank and under siege in the world's largest open-air prison, a subject of an ongoing genocide, that is Gaza. And we are all familiar with Netanyahu's plans at the United, or Netanyahu's maps rather, at the United Nations, but also in press conferences in Israel itself, in which Palestine is completely wiped out. There is no reference to Palestine or the Palestinian people. And if you're still having some doubts about it, just read the text of the so-called nation-state law that dismisses any Palestinian presence, any Palestinian history, any Palestinian right to self-determination, and only emphasizes the opposite. So Israel is a settler-colonial state. If Israel is not a settler-colonial state, I would be living in a village called Beit Daras right now, and I don't know why I would be even engaged with you in a Zoom conversation from Beit Daras, because there wouldn't be a so-called conflict to speak of, or ethnically cleansed Palestinians, or a genocide, or anything of that nature. That's the truth of it. Now, some people would like to overlook that truth for their own interest, or just because they feel uncomfortable of truth of this magnitude, but that's the reality of it. But what I would like to talk about today, and I promise 45 minutes, but if I do exceed, Roberta or Hassan, please feel free to jump in there and just to say, you need to stop. Because I think there's another important component here that is becoming more and more relevant in the last few weeks, last few months, in the last 2 years in particular, because of the genocide, which is this Israeli settler colonialism. What is the relationship between Israeli settler colonialism and European, Western, American colonialism and neocolonialism? And therefore, who controls the other? Who has the sway, the power to rein in the other? Is Israel an American or a Western installment or a Western implant in the Middle East? Or is Israel a representation of the powerful Zionist movement? In fact, is the state or the entity that holds all the cards? Now, why is this important? I know the debate has been raging on for years, and some people that we love and respect, the likes of Professor Noam Chomsky, argued that to the contrary, Israel is essentially an extension of American imperialism and is not independent on its own without American support. And the others are saying, well, maybe that was the case at one point, but the relationship has changed over time. So if you don't mind, I would like to talk about trying to understand this particular issue. And think of this as not as a lecture, me lecturing you or anyone, but rather me trying to understand based on historical evidence. Why is this question important during the time of genocide? I mean, isn't there something of greater urgency than this question? I think it is very important, because those who are interested in creating some sort of a rupture in the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv would like to know, so that they know how to focus their efforts properly. Before we do this, let's just talk about what are the models that the United States uses to control or to influence its allies. Therefore, we have to talk about the client regime model. The client regime model is simple, is as simple as that of Jordan, King Abdullah of Jordan. And if there's any Jordanian in the audience, I'm really not picking on Abdullah per se, but just because it's a really good example of a client regime that doesn't have a great deal of control over the political yieldings, the political discourse or action of his own country and his own government. Abdullah cannot really control anything when it comes to issues that may oppose American interests and American diktat. The country is practically occupied. You have American soldiers and military bases operating in Jordan. They can do whatever they want. In fact, in 2024, as of rather 2024, this has been going on for years now, there are 3 known and recognized military installations in Jordan, one in Salt, one in, I believe, Zarqa, and the famous Prince Hassan Air Base, along with others that might not be announced or recognized. This happened as a result of what they call the Defense Cooperation Agreement, signed in 2021, granting U.S. forces free movement and immunity and access to all facilities that are deemed necessary for regional security. Who defines the term regional security? Washington does, not Jordan. Now, this means that the US can bestow protection or take it away. They don't need Jordanian permission to act. For example, they can shoot down Iranian missiles coming towards Israel to protect Israel, but they are not allowed to shoot Israeli missiles or Israeli airplanes flying over Jordan to carry out military operations in Iraq, Syria, or Iran. So in a sense, Jordan is an occupied territory for the United States. And I'm here not talking according to a settler-colonial model. I'm not even talking about the traditional colonial model per se. I am talking about effective military occupation from a strategic point of view, total strategic control over Jordan's foreign policy and security and airspace and so forth. So this is not about raw material or old colonial theory. It's about the US controlling that particular territory for strategic purposes. Now, let's imagine that, if anybody can see me, if Jordan is here, Bahrain would be here. That's another good example. The US formed, when the US formed a coalition against Ansarullah in Yemen for daring to take a stance regarding Gaza, they wanted to, send them a strong message that the Americans are not to be messed with, and Ansarullah cannot control the Red Sea. And so they formed a coalition. There were 2 coalitions. The first started during the Biden administration, and I think it was called Operation Prosperity, or rather, Operation Prosperity Guardian. That was in December 18, 2023. And then you have the new coalition that was formed with the Trump administration. And it seemed that Bahrain, some argued that Bahrain was enlisted in that coalition to bomb and to strike Ansarullah and to violate the sovereignty of Yemen without even Bahrain being consulted. And so there are kind of various reasons that they're saying that Bahrain was not even consulted. And it really is not entirely surprising if that was the case, because at the end of the day, you have in Manama, in the capital of Bahrain, you have the US Fifth Fleet being permanently based there. So when you have that kind of power and military hegemony over a tiny little space like Manama and Bahrain, what kind of power does that client regime have to balance out American influence and American control? Now, they are not really being forced to do so. Some of them are happy to oblige because they need America to survive. They need the protection. And this is how it usually happens. For example, you have in Bahrain, you have a majority of the population being Shia. And by the way, I don't like these terminologies, Shia, Sunni, but we live in a world in which, sadly, sectarianism is being used as a kind of a unit of analysis. And people do behave according to that kind of sectarian alignments and realignments. So we are forced to think about it around these lines. So I'm only using it for the sake of kind of conveying my point as opposed to me believing that we should be necessarily always thinking about the Middle East in terms of sectarian language. But you do have a largely Shia population in Bahrain that loathes the Sunni ruling family and the Sunni king. Now, the king is willing to do anything to suppress his own people, and he has done it. He brought the Saudis before, the Americans are there to protect against the majority of his own people, not just the Shia, but also the discontented and impoverished poor Sunnis who rightly believe that they live under a dictatorship with no rights whatsoever. So, for these client regimes, America is the oxygen. They need to survive, and they need America to sustain that survival. And on the other hand, they also have no leverage over the US. So you kind of end up with this kind of relationship. You would think, okay, so this is Jordan, this is Bahrain. Is this anything lower than this? Yes. You have these countries that, if you notice, every time there is a UN resolution, mostly pertaining to Palestine, but any other issue in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East, you have these countries, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Palau, and others, always voting in line with the US. So you always have the US, Israel, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. I mean, I'm sure that some of you might have wondered, like, what's going on here? I mean, what do these countries have against the Palestinians? What did we ever do to Micronesia to be treating us so badly like this? Always voting against, any attempt at holding Israel accountable. Well, there is really nothing between us and Micronesia. It's not personal. These islands have signed an agreement with the US. It's called the Compact of Free Association. It grants the US full authority over their defense and foreign affairs. Full authority. In exchange for a certain amount of money, not a lot, honestly. I mean, the last agreement was signed was in 2023, and it lasts until 2043, about 20 years, of a total of $3.3 billion. And we are going to talk about how much Israel gets from the US compared to this amount. So $3.3 billion to all of these islands over the course of 20 years. And I'm sure a lot of this money, I haven't looked this up, but it's typical this way that much of the US military presence and naval activities, usually it's kind of funded by this money as well, and yet distributed over the course of 20 years in order for these islands and for these areas to consent that they basically have no defense policies that are unique to them or any foreign policy that is separate from the United States. So if anybody was wondering, that's why these countries always vote in line with the US, because they can't otherwise. So these are the examples that are kind of the most kind of typical client regime relationships. But it doesn't mean that the Saudis, for example, are completely above that category. But the Saudis are a little bit different. They're still a client regime, but they have a great deal of economic prowess. They have diversified their foreign relations. They are trying to muscle their way out, buying leverage with countries like China, sending signals to the US that they have some elements of sovereignty, especially when, for example, when they refuse to allow the oil prices to be manipulated according to American interests, and so forth and so on. And they've done it many times, which shows that the Saudis have greater leverage because they are an economic power. They want to normalize with Israel, clearly, but America would have to give them something in return, and that has to be something very convincing. And if they don't get it, then they don't necessarily have to normalize. There is some margins, there's give and take, yet somehow they are still privileged, they are still client regime, but in a way that is slightly more privileged, or significantly rather more privileged than others. My second point is I want to talk about how Israel fits into this. Israel has been the most privileged client regime for the United States, to the point that it stands on the edge of the entire client regime category, bordering on something else. That something else is a different kind of status. America calls it partnership, but I think there is more to it than partnership, because the US refers pretty much to everyone as a partner. Our partners in the Middle East, our partners in Europe, our partners in Asia. Of course, Jordan is not a partner. The real partners, however, are countries like Israel and few other European countries, Germany, Britain, France. But even within this so-called partnership category, many of these states remain somewhat operating within that client regime relationship. We saw how the US dragged Britain into the Iraq war. Tony Blair was delighted. He was wagging his tail in excitement. This is why he obtained the term America's poodle. He was wagging his tail in total and utter excitement because he was being included and honored to be part of this special relationship that allowed his country to take part in one of the most unjust and bloody wars in Middle East history, when they went to war against Iraq in 2003. The US, in a way, breathed life into Britain's colonial prestige. After having, shrunk and become almost irrelevant in global affairs, suddenly Britain has become a global partner in the war on terror. It's still essentially a client regime, different status, still subordinate. The US calls them friends, but in reality, they really don't have a great deal of influence over the political outcomes. Okay, so I'm just going to skip a little bit here. I had a few points I want to talk about Ukraine and how the Europe fits into this, but due to the element of time, let me just jump a little bit into something else. I'm going to go back to Israel. Initially, Israel began, when it became a state, it began being just another Middle Eastern client regime. But the most special of them all, at the top of that hierarchy, almost European in its essence, and in the type of relationship it has forged with Washington from the very start. The reason behind that special status is that Zionism is a Western concept. So let me just tell you where I am going with this. I do not believe that we really have to contend with the question of who controls whom, and more with how that relationship was forged and changed and molded over time and over the years, and how it could potentially change as a result of the Gaza genocide. Because Zionism emerged in the late 19th century, primarily within Central and Eastern European Jewish intellectual circles. It was deeply intertwined with Western colonial and nationalist ideologies. Its early leaders were European politicians, journalists, and intellectuals influenced by various cultural phenomena phenomena like the Enlightenment and others. And also, kind of in a way, consented to the European racial hierarchies that existed during that time. It was hardly a Middle Eastern reality or an outcome of anything that resembles the Middle East. It's a foreign alien movement. Because of this, the ideologues of Zionism were themselves Western officials or figures deeply embedded in Western politics. Take Chaim Weizmann, as he's called in Israel, for instance. He was highly influential in British politics during the Great War. He was so influential to the point that some argue it's because of that type of relationship and the circle, intellectual and political circle he forged around him, he may have been one of the most important figures in the establishment of the foundation that led to the creation of Israel. Look at Zev Jabotinsky. He maintained very close ties with Italian fascism, modeled his brand of Zionist revisionism on fascism itself, to the point that the uniforms they wore, the hand signals they used, were directly inspired by Mussolini's followers. I've done an article about this. I think it was published in Al Jazeera a few years ago, talking about the similarities and the relationship between historical revisionism and the relationship it had with Mussolini in particular. And I wouldn't call it friendship, but the kind of familiarity that existed between Jabotinsky and Mussolini. And of course, you have the likes of Theodor Herzl, a Vienna-based journalist and a playwright who worked in the heart of European political society, among many other examples. They all operated within Western corridors of power. Jabotinsky's Jewish Legion, by the way, was trained under the British in World War I. Yet the Betar youth movement, which is the kind of the military arm of that movement, adopted the aesthetics, the style, and the language, and the hand signals of European paramilitary nationalism. In other words, Zionist leaders were Western leaders. They were products of the Western political order and experience. This is why, by the way, the narrative, I mean, we talk about, oh, the media, how mainstream media shapes, is so biased. It's not about bias or lack thereof. It's about the fact that the media itself has always, or Zionism has always been presented as the main creator of meaning regarding Palestine, the language, the discourse. It's not a group of people who come from the outside trying to influence mainstream media. Yes, they do that, but it's not exactly that. It is the fact that there was no such thing as pro-Palestine, pro-Arab, pro-Muslim, pro-human rights, pro-socialist, pro-global South, component that was fighting with that Western component to influence media, academia, and mainstream society. There was nothing but the Zionists, and the Zionists were very much European individuals and an outcome of European experiences. Actually, a few weeks ago, I went to the very building in Rome where Jabotinsky was coming to an occasion, kind of a usual meeting with Mussolini. To further solidify the alliance between the fascists and the Zionists, and at that point, Mussolini had switched to kind of opened or rather became part of the Nazi alliance and the Axis, and as a result, Jabotinsky was stopped on the stairs and he was told to turn around. Mussolini had no longer had any affinity or any business with him. But up to that point, that's the kind of relationship, and it's very well documented. It's not a claim. The same dynamic applies to those who shaped the Balfour Declaration. So it wasn't just the British, like Sir Balfour himself, but also the Americans who influenced the language and the advocacy happening during that time. There is an interesting article, I wrote the title here for anybody interested in reading it, called The Hidden Role of the US in Britain's Balfour Declaration by Alison Weir. You can judge for yourself who had greater influence on shaping the Balfour Declaration, but the thing that remains clear that American Zionists were as influential as British Zionists in creating the document and creating the policy before and during the publishing of that document. So this is not purely British colonial experience, it's an American colonial experience as well. So this is the conclusion here of what I'm trying to say, is that Zionism is a Western phenomenon. It's a product of Western elitism and Western political culture. It is not a Middle Eastern one. Therefore, there has always been, from the very beginning, deep Western investment in Zionism and therefore in Israel. Edward Said discusses this in length in Orientalism, but also in other books and articles that he has written, tracing the phenomenon of that's kind of Western, Zion. He calls it the pre-Zionism. It traces it back to even to the 13th and 14th century, starting with the early Christian missions to Palestine and the ideological formation of what later became known as pre-Zionism. There's a in Orientalism, he notes how Western artists, missionaries, colonial officers projected Palestine as a divine and civilizational project long before Herzl, what he calls the Christian imagination of the Holy Land. Napoleon's 1799 proclamation offering Palestine to Jewish and fundamentalist Christian groups in Europe, along with the British missionary mapping of Palestine, all the way to the 19th century travel literature, all served as cultural precursors of political Zionism. The West, therefore, has long been invested in all forms of proto-Zionism, leading to Theodor Herzl's political doctrine in the late 19th century. So, to think about Zionism as a starting point in the late 19th century with Herzl is to miss the massive culture that has allowed that movement to take shape and to be followed through with real action, leading to the uprooting of a whole nation, the Palestinian people, from their historic homeland. That special relationship became even more entrenched after World War II, and particularly the Holocaust, one of the greatest crimes in modern history against a civilian population. But the Holocaust was instrumental, or instrumentalized rather, to the benefit of Zionism as a political doctrine. You might ask, would the West have committed itself to Zionism even without the Holocaust? And I would say yes. But that commitment had not yet penetrated the consciousness of the ordinary Western citizen. You have to understand the nature of the unspeakable crime at the time and the fact that it had the fingers and the tentacles of various Western societies all involved in that crime has created that kind of needed consciousness that carried on for a very long time, that allowed people to in the West to sympathize with Israel, even though at times they may have felt uncomfortable with some of the language, some of the ideologies, some of the practices of Israel. So that's what made Israel's position unique and different over the years, not your everyday client regime. The relationship was not just one of political urgency, but of deep, long-term emotional and cultural commitment involving both governments and people. And we are going to talk about how the Gaza genocide has finally kind of challenged that paradigm that existed for decades. Now, that doesn't mean that the West and Zionism have always maintained the same kind of relationship. Of course, the relationship evolved. The difference, I would say, is that the United States wanted to ensure that Israel, as part of Western imperial strategy, served American neo-colonialism in the Middle East. Washington wanted to guarantee two things. First, that Israel remained beneficial to American power, and second, that it could be protected from itself, as Trump is now trying to protect Israel from Israel, to maintain policy consistency across broader Western projects in the region. You recall the statement that was made repeatedly by Biden. Biden gets excited about certain statements and he just keeps saying them over and over like a broken record. And like, for example, I am a Zionist. You don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. I'm not a Jewish, I'm a Zionist. Hey, I trace that statement to I think the first time it was made in the 80s. I mean, it's been going on and on about that. But another thing he has been also saying, and he kind of maintained that until the very end of his term, was if Israel did not exist, we would have created Israel. And this at least in principle, is consistent with the idea that the US wanted Israel to be part of its imperialist strategy in the Middle East, although in practice, Biden wasn't really utilizing Israel to serve American interests because he had no idea what Netanyahu is doing or wanted to achieve in the first place. Now, the alignment worked reasonably well up to 1967. That's when Israel supposedly defeated all Arab armies single-handedly. I challenge that claim. And sadly, many Arabs and Arab intellectuals also kind of this crying over the ruins type of mentality make that claim. But it wasn't Israel that single-handedly defeated all Arab armies. That is kind of really meant to break the collective spirits of Arabs to make them look so weak and pathetic. It was a Western war fought in the Middle East, backed logistically and militarily by the US and others. The generation that lived during the 1967 war, for example, knew the Mirage, the French Mirage airplane, and the incredible work it can do in terms of blowing things up and the firepower of the Mirage. That happened during the Six-Day War. The US providing intelligence, British and French arms flowed through European channels. The Johnson administration approved emergency munitions to shipments to Israel time and again. The CIA shared all sorts of intelligence with the Israeli army. Western naval fleets in the Mediterranean remained on alert to deter any potential Soviet involvement, and so forth. That is a war that Israel has won collectively with the West, not alone. But still, that the outcome of that war allowed Israel to present itself as a new powerful entity, not merely an extension of Western interest, but a power in its own right, demanding to be treated as an equal partner of the West. If you look at some of the literature regarding Israel's behavior after the war, vis-a-vis American culture, American mainstream culture, American media, American universities, you're going to find that there was hundreds, if not more, of Israeli officers, soldiers, and people who were involved in the war that came and went into these tours across American high schools, universities, and churches, and so forth and so on, presenting this new image of the Israeli soldier, strong, efficient, undefeatable, to replace the earlier narrative of the poor Israel that is being targeted by all these angry Arabs and is facing this perpetual threat of annihilation and all of that. There was a new kind of the Israeli superhero that is being created. And the message of that is not a psychological message to Israel's supporters, but a message to the American administration that we are no longer contented being the country that needs to be protected. You need to take us very serious as the most powerful country in the Middle East, and you need to behave accordingly. But Zionists did something else, equally important. They worked very hard to influence American decision makers, the Congress. This was when AIPAC was established. Now, AIPAC has been around for a long time. It was established in the 1950s, sometimes in the I want to say 1955, 1954. And it was an extension of another organization that existed called the American Zionist Council. But AIPAC later on began taking on different forms. At first, it extended its influence through financial supports, donation, campaign funds, cultivating relationships, but later through open political pressures and intimidation, using the language of threat to keep everyone in line, which continues to happen up to this moment. Now, this did not take place overnight. Ilan Pappé, Professor Ilan Pappé, and I do agree with that assessment that the first time that AIPAC truly flexed its muscles was in the 1980s, particularly as a result of an American arms deal with Saudi Arabia that would allow the Saudis to receive the AWACS early warning systems. Billions of dollars were to be paid for that deal. Israel did not like the idea because it felt like, yes, maybe the Saudis are not a threat now. They could be a threat in the future, and we cannot concede what Bill Clinton later on refers to as Israel's military edge to anybody, even the Saudis themselves. Professor Pappé speaks about this in his book, The Idea of Israel, 2014. And I quote from the AWACS episode, quote, "The moment AIPAC, that was the moment that AIPAC demonstrated its ability to discipline the Congress." So in 1981, despite President Reagan's backing of the sale, AIPAC orchestrated a massive campaign that pressured legislators, bombarded media outlets, and made examples of dissenters that eventually allowed AIPAC to defeat the AWACS deal that was canceled, and that was the moment that everyone was indeed taking AIPAC very, very seriously. Also, that was the period in which we began seeing books like They Dare to Speak Out. That was, for my generation, that was the Bible, if you will, of the kind of literature that was being produced early on to send warning messages to American society that you have a foreign entity that is getting so involved in your politics that is actually shaping US foreign policy in the Middle East. They Dare to Speak Out. I still recommend this book. It was edited by former Congressman Paul Findley, who himself paid the price for standing against the lobby, and it was published in 1985. The lobby began expanding. AIPAC was no longer the only major player. It became one arm of a broader network. That network was discussed by Professor John Mearsheimer and John Walt, I believe, or I think John Walt, in their book, The Israel Lobby and US Foreign Policy. And they described the lobby at that point as a loose coalition of individuals and organizations that actively works to steer US foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. Very polite language, but essentially what they were saying that this is not your kind of 8 to 4 type of lobbyist with a small office somewhere in a Washington, D.C. neighborhood, making telephone calls and trying to kind of get the Congress to vote according, to the interests of that particular group. We are talking about a whole new culture that was springing up from everywhere. Groups, some of it political, ideological, religious, and others that worked day and night to enforce and reinforce the pro-Israel agenda. In other words, it became a political culture. And they went directly to the legislators. For example, AIPAC worked directly with the legislators, but other groups like the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, worked to influence civil society. I was surprised the first time when I went to the US back in my early 20s and I was watching the Super Bowl to see AIPAC, the ADL, having commercials within the Super Bowl, which is like the most watched moment in American TV. They have that kind of sway. And of course, if you cross them, if you challenge them, if you say, well, maybe American foreign policy should be the business of America, or anything of that nature, then the smear campaigns start, the accusations, and the weaponization of anti-Semitism to silence critics. And I think, based on the introduction we've heard earlier today, you kind of had a little taste of that yourself. Of course, Hollywood was always involved in this because, again, we are talking about a whole cultural system reinforcing Zionist narratives, a culture and a political apparatus that reached its peak during the Iraq War. What happened during the Iraq War? So you have this group called the neoconservatives, essentially just another manifestations of the Zionist lobby. Same individuals, but this time they are operating under the guise of intellectuals. You've got to love this when the likes of Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and Richard Pearl, among others, are being perceived as the intellectuals. And you see them, kind of these popping head, talking heads on Fox and CNN everywhere, promoting this idea that what we are doing in Iraq is the right thing and the war is the only option, and the Iraqis are going to be receiving us with flowers and and stuff like that. And at the end, they've used films, of course, news framing, celebrity endorsements, and all in the name of, well, what we are doing in Iraq, we are spreading democracy. And once we spread democracy to Iraq, we are going to spread it all across the Middle East. And from there, we are going to acquire our new Middle East. You've got to, I'm sure that you must have heard the term, the new Middle East, repeated so many times. They've been talking about the new Middle East since and even before the Iraq War, but the Iraq War was like, this becomes a doctrine. What is the new Middle East? Is a Middle East that is aligned with Israeli interest first, and second with American interest. And this is why, by the way, I always refer to the so-called Arab Spring. I rarely say the Arab Spring, because if you trace the etymology of the term the Arab Spring, that also comes from the neoconservatives. And it came about not in 2011 in Tunisia, it came about during the Iraq War. They were talking about the Arab Spring back then. And this is why the term itself is suspicious, and I would rather steer away from it altogether. But this was the moment when Israel's influence reached its height, a time when one could argue that Israel was practically dictating US foreign policy. The Iraq War should have never happened, but it did, largely due to the power of the neoconservatives and other arms of the same network. But many of the US establishments starting then began to realize that what Israel was doing and what its allies inside Washington were promoting was dangerous and counterproductive. The influence of Israel and the lobby was so intense that they were pushing the United States towards wars that served Israeli interests, not American ones. And back at the time, they were talking in the media. I think it was the New York Times, but I don't have that researched very recently. But they spoke about the need to invade 6 or 7 Arab countries all at the same time. Again, all with the hope of trying to reshape and recreate the Middle East, or this new Middle East that would supposedly fit and benefit Israeli and American interests. Think about Iran, for example. What benefit does the US ever gain from threatening or bombing Iran? None. These actions only served Israeli strategic goals, because Iran is not a strategic threat to the United States. And many Americans, even within the right, are now saying the same thing. You all remember 2015, I think it was March 2015, when Benjamin Netanyahu basically spoke to both chambers of the US Congress and openly attacked Barack Obama, arguably the most popular president of the US in decades, over the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear deal. At the time, I think Biden was the vice president, and he pretended that he had some sort of business in China because he did not want to be caught in a position where he had to make a choice between listening to Netanyahu or supporting America's most popular president in 100 years. Obama is isolated in the White House. Both sides of both chambers of the US Congress are giving Netanyahu standing ovation after standing ovation. That address was arranged by then House Speaker John Boehner without the White House's consent. Netanyahu spoke about how bad the deal is and how Israeli security is being compromised, to a thunderous applause. In fact, it is believed, not believed, it's well recorded, that the Congress stood and applauded 26 times in under 1 hour. And he would say, why are you counting, Ramzy? Who was counting? I wasn't counting. The lobby was counting. AIPAC was counting, because they later used the reactions of each member of the Congress, using that data to inform the political donations ahead of the 2016 election cycle. I mean, to that extent, as if elected American representatives are basically puppets whose job and responsibility is to appease AIPAC and by extension Israel. Now, that was not exactly the behavior of a client regime, especially during that period. It was of something else entirely. Now, let's fast forward to the Gaza genocide. When the genocide began, Israel was riding high. As we say in Arabic, let's see if I can translate this, climbing in this case, climbing on America's back and dangling both legs. It was that comfortable in terms of the influence it had over American foreign policy in the Middle East. It had real total control, or almost total influence, total sway. Biden appeared like a child. He tried his best to make Israel's genocide appear beneficial to his own country. But he was struggling. There was really no logic of why killing all of those Palestinians, butchering babies, could possibly be understood to be part of American strategic thinking. America's doctrine in the Middle East is very well known. They want stability, they want control, they want hegemony, they want resources, they want power, they want client regimes, they want influence, but they also want to do it in a way that would allow them to stabilize, because that would lead to normalization, and normalization leads to money and projects and all of that. But Netanyahu was doing something else entirely. Biden was so insistent on galvanizing on the genocide to achieve something political to justify the prolonged American support of Israel. So he sends Antony Blinken, a Zionist loyalist, to Arab capitals, hoping to end the genocide through normalization that would appeal to Netanyahu. Just normalize with Israel and they will stop killing Palestinians. I mean, why is this such a difficult concept to grasp? And the Arabs actually were ready to normalize, but Netanyahu was not interested because he had bigger ambitions. In 2024, for example, he publicly spoke openly about the Greater Israel idea. He told Likud members at the time, from the river to the sea, Israel's security control must be absolute. Well, later on, actually, in 2025, he started talking about Greater Israel as a control over the region itself. And the sad, funny, strange, weird thing that Arab rulers were, there was a bashful protest from Egypt, but not much from Jordan, as if the man did not just promise to colonize much of the Middle East in, chasing some sort of a messianic or a religious notion. But then something happened that nobody expected. Now, Trump began his presidency believing he could do what Biden could not. Yet he still also failed to translate Israel's war into political gains. He discovered that even with support from figures like Miriam Edelson, the widow of casino magnate Sheldon Edelson, one of the biggest supporters of Israel, Miriam Edelson gave him $100 million. And I am sure more from many others, in order for him to allow Israel to annex the West Bank and all the rest. So he kind of tried another way of normalizing with the Arabs in exchange for ending the genocide. But here's the twist. There's this saying that we all know, be careful what you wish for you might get it. I think that's how it goes. Netanyahu wanted to destroy Gaza, and he did. He wanted to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, but he couldn't, because the Palestinians refused to leave. And I think that's really the decisive factor in this. There was a study by a Ramallah-based research group that found out that majority of Palestinians in Gaza, that people living during the genocide, where their babies, their families, their men and women are being pulverized by Israeli US supplied bombs. And they were asked, if the border with Rafah, with Egypt is open, if there's no wall, would you leave? Just for the record, the poll was conducted by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research in December 2024. It found out that 73% of respondents in Gaza said they would refuse to relocate to Egypt under any circumstance, despite the bombardment and the genocide and the famine and the displacement. This means that the people themselves defeated Netanyahu's ethnic cleansing plan, which was the ultimate objective that Netanyahu had during that genocide. The Palestinian people defeated it through their sumud, steadfastness, and the resistance. Because their resistance, and yes, I am talking about armed struggle and armed resistance, the resistance managed to disallow Israel, to put it mildly, from achieving any of its military strategic objectives in Gaza, and the people, by refusing to leave, because they could have gathered in very large numbers in Rafah and appealed to the Egyptians to open the border. Maybe that would have made it easier for Sisi to justify why he opened the borders, but they didn't. Israel could not control Gaza. And as a result, the tables began turning. And I think we are now in the process of the tables being, turning. Remember how we earlier talked about how in World War II and the tragedies that accompanied World War II has created this perfect fusion between government and popular support for Zionism in the West. Well, that is now being largely reversed. Governments still support Israel, some out of habits, others out of calculation. But public opinion no longer does. The new genocide, Holocaust in Gaza has broken the emotional bond between Zionism and Western publics. Even governments with a shred of conscience, Spain, Norway, Belgium, Slovenia, Ireland, among others, began jumping ship, declaring that supporting Israel's war was not moral, was not ethical, was not legal, and is not in their national interest. And then came Netanyahu's remarks to Trump's remarks to Netanyahu when he said that famous statement that he repeated several times since then, quote, "Bibi, you cannot fight the world." I would say that that statement marked a turning point, not only in the war, but in the history of Zionism itself and its relationship with the West. Netanyahu is now hated by his own people, loathed by the international community, and Israel is viewed as a pariah state, despised by nearly everyone except a handful of political elites in Washington and few other Western capitals. Economically and militarily, Israel is completely dependent on American aid. Compare this, what's happening now, to that triumphant moment of Netanyahu standing in front of the Congress, basically acting as if an emperor, dictating American foreign policy and putting demands on the US regarding the Iran nuclear deal, which, by the way, he managed to achieve later on during Trump's first term in office. But the situation has changed. There was a $26 billion package to Israel in 2024, followed by additional billions from Trump and the $3.8 billion annual commitment under the Obama era Memorandum of Understanding. So you have the $26 billion, the supplemental package to Israel was approved by Congress in April 2024. Then you have the 10-year Memorandum of Understanding, a total of $38 billion. Then you had, in 2025, a budget proposal that was added for missile defense and reconstruction funds of another $12 billion. Yes, you can talk about how insane this is, that Israel is receiving all of this money to sustain a genocide in Gaza, but you also could think of it in a different way, of how Israel has suddenly found itself surviving completely on American handouts. This whole narrative of being an independent sovereign state, in the words of Ben-Gvir, among others, that Israel is not another star on the American flag, is just empty talk. When it comes to money, weapons, and logistics, Israel has to bow to Washington. Even the lobby itself has weakened. The report suggests that AIPAC, I think Haaretz had several articles about it, the last being in mid-2025, that talks about how Haaretz, but also The Intercept, that had more kind of an investigative report about how AIPAC is struggling in its fundraising, it's struggling in its ability to impact policy. Its reputation has sharply declined over Netanyahu's genocide policy and the loss of bipartisan support in Congress. This means that the relationship is once more changing. Zionism remains a Western ideology and Israel remains a Western implant, but the dynamics are shifting. The sway Israel, and I'm almost done here, the sway Israel had over US foreign policy from 1967 through the 1980s, through the Iraq War, Netanyahu's 2015 speech, all the way to the Gaza genocide of 2023, that period of dominance is ending. Maybe temporarily, maybe not. It's to be seen. Now we see people like Jared Kushner, for example, and Steve Witkoff speaking at a large Israeli rallies in Tel Aviv, being cheered when they talk about America, but booed when they mention Netanyahu's name. We see the American chief of staff marking US territories in southern Israel, basically ensuring that Israeli actions remain consistent with American expectations. There is a new American agenda forming, one in which Israel is an important piece, but not the centerpiece. Netanyahu, of course, is trying to reclaim his position of power. The massacres and the bombings that continued after the supposed truce or ceasefire is his way of sending a message that I'm still in control, I act independently, even against American advice. These are not messages to Hamas, not messages to Gaza or to the Palestinians. They are messages to his domestic audience in Israel, the right wing, and the extremists in Israel, which dominate Israeli society, to reassure Israelis that their country remains sovereign and independent from American diktat. But the truth is, it's not over yet. We are now at a juncture where Israel will do everything in its power, with US help, to reclaim its pre-genocide status as a regional powerhouse and a favorite of Western elites in politics, media, academia, and beyond. Meanwhile, the United States is trying to ensure that Israel remains under control and does not act in ways that contradict Western interests. Washington wants to rein in Israel. At the end of the day, however, it's still somewhat a storm in a cup. It all remains a Zionist project, a Western project. It all remains part of the same imperial agenda. The only question, or the main question to be asked now, who now has the greater sway in determining the details of that new agenda? Is it being carried out for the sake of Israel and Israel alone, or is it being carried out for the sake of Western interests, with Zionism and Israel as one of several important components? I rest my case, and thank you so much for listening. I know I exceeded my time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baroud. Thank you for this detailed explanation from your lecture. So if you allow me, it was mentioned Middle East. So let me please cross the academic traditions and also the Eurocentric and Oriental discourse, because you have mentioned that in the Western politic makers, so talking about the new Middle East and Middle East, and if you allow me to use also one of the questions to you, Middle West and Far West, if you allow me to cross this discourse. And before my question, I ask kindly our audience online and also the presence. So if you please to prepare questions to Dr. Baroud. So in the chat, I will take care of them and ask directly Dr. Baroud. If you want to be your name mentioned, please just write after the question your name. If you don't want, we respect that. And sorry, and Roberta will take care of the questions. Meanwhile, so I will ask Dr. Baroud the following question, please, as a journalist and an academic so specialized in Palestinian affairs. How do you assess the awareness of Middle Eastern and Far Eastern youth regarding the fact that Israel is a settler state? I mean, in the last years, in the last 2 years till now. Please, Doctor.
You know, sometimes you don't want to be vindicated because being vindicated comes at a price. And I think the genocide, from an intellectual point of view, has vindicated people like me, but it came at the price of a genocide and the destruction of all of Gaza. But my point is this. For a long time, we have always been saying that in order for Zionism to be defeated, and by the way, I neither champion one state, and at this point, nor I do believe that coexistence is the obvious, logical, and as just conclusion as possible. I don't think that's a top priority right now. I think the top priority is to expose Zionism, because as long as Zionism exists, as long as you are going to have war and you're going to have conflict, and even if Palestine is a state, you know, a disarmed state, Israel, Zionism will always find a way to crush it. They will always find a way to go after Syria, after Lebanon, after everybody else. The problem is Zionism is not territorial sectionalization of the map. That said, we, many people like myself, have always argued that Palestinians, and I would say the same thing applies to Lebanon and Syria and elsewhere, they would have to be the center of their own story. They have to be those who shape the narrative. And they have to be, not only reclaim their own narrative, but they have to be platformed. They have to be centered in telling the Palestinian story from their own point of view. Because academic discussions, as intriguing as they can be, will never truly communicate the emotional experience to the rest of the world. Antonio Gramsci, I would say my favorite intellectual, any time, anywhere, used to say that an intellectual should not stay away from communicating feelings and emotions. Because yes, political elites and economic interest groups, they go after power and after financial benefits, but ordinary people don't connect that way. They connect through emotions, through feelings. And I would say, as a result, that the 2 years of genocide, because of the powerful voice of the Palestinians living in Gaza, managed to do so much damage to the Zionist discourse within 2 years that all of other efforts have done collectively over the course of 100 years. And they have done it during genocide and during famine. And they have done it despite of the complete, not despite, but because of the fact that mainstream media was not allowed to Gaza. Because if the New York Times and the BBC and others were allowed to Gaza, they would have found a way to spin the story and to create distractions. Palestinians, who many of them were speaking in Arabic, but because of people like us all over the world, we were conveying the messages. We were not creating the meaning for the messages. We were conveying the messages to the rest of the world, translating and empowering and amplifying. But at the end of the day, it was their original message that connected with young people all around the world. Social media, ordinary people in the streets. Since the beginning of the genocide, I have been to nearly 20 countries, so many cities, villages, towns in the middle of Abruzzo in Italy, places that you would have thought that they would have not cared about what's happening in Rome, needless to say, in Gaza. Yet somehow you see pro-Palestine consciousness happening everywhere. Palestinian flags, Palestinian symbolism. You can't drive anywhere in much of Europe, but particular countries like Spain, Italy, and elsewhere, you can't drive for 5 minutes without seeing a Palestinian flag. Napoli is covered. Napoli is basically is a Palestinian area at this point, and the kind of messages that are so deep and so involved, not just free Palestine or stop the genocide, but free specific Palestinian prisoners, People in Napoli are aware of what's happening. People in many parts of Europe are aware of what's happening. This is why when they called for a general strike in Italy, it happened immediately. 2 million people were in the streets protesting for Gaza. And that's where the Zionist dilemma, because they have created this pro-Israel spectacle using traditional media, control over this and that, complete sidelining of the Palestinian voice. I always argue, by that way, that the Zionist propaganda is not as powerful as you think it is. To the contrary, it is just because of our voice is not there. You are canceled if you speak about this issue. Your classes or your reservations and or rather your like what's happening with the university right now, canceling your events. They try to marginalize you, to mask you, to push you out entirely so that your voice is not heard. Not because their propaganda is powerful, because we're not there to counter that propaganda, what Gaza did. And Gaza connected, the youth of Gaza connected with the youth of everywhere. And as a result, you have this new amalgamation of people's power from Palestine to the rest of the world, and it's circumventing all the obstacles and all the methods created by Zionism to prevent the Palestinian voice from breaking free from the Gaza prison, from the West Bank, from the apartheid areas. And this is very, very important. And this is why I think Zionism, this is where the whole concept of Bibi, you can't fight the world. Well, how did the world find out Bibi and Trump? How did they find out? Who told them? It's certainly not CNN, not the New York Times. Other agents have told them. And the agents are the Palestinians to begin with, and independent groups, social media activists, podcasters, ordinary people all over the world. And that needs to be sustained. We need to continue to build on that. We can't lose it, because believe me, the Zionists are already talking and working and holding conferences of how do you win the narrative back. So we have to know what are our centers of power in order for us to build on them and to continue to sustain this narrative until we break the back of Zionism altogether.
Okay, so the first question from the chat here, and then the next one from Roberta. And would you please, Doctor, so just to be a little bit short, so to allow how much is of our guests and audience so to ask you and to have contact. They are eager to hear from you. There is here a question. Could you please compare it, the Settler-Colonial project in Palestine, with other settler colonies? What are the similarities and differences?
Right. So I'm gonna try to be very brief, and you have to be very bold in telling me, Ramzy, just stop. But it's just because this is an issue that comes up quite often. First of all, the concept of settler colonialism was not a Western invention. It is Palestinians have been talking about settler colonialism much earlier than Professor Wolf and many others have been talking about it. They were aware that what Israel or rather what Zionism was doing was not a traditional form of colonialism. It wasn't about resources per se or strategic control. It was that, but it was about something else, which is the depopulation of the native population and to kind of the takeover of their homes and their lands and so forth and so on. But clearly, Israel is not your typical settler colonial model, as in, I just go somewhere and I push the population out and I take over, or I stay, but I dominate them. For example, in South Africa, where the population, yes, it's a settler colonial model, but at the same time, the Black populations were exploited to the absolute maximum. And they were, pushed into Bantustans and into various kind of, apartheid, these kind of apartheid designated areas in which they are being treated as lesser, but they were important in the sense that they were the cheap laborers that needed to sustain the economy. In the case of Palestine, yes, they tried that model for a while, up to the first Intifada, because it was the Israeli laborers, my father and my uncle and others, are the ones who actually built the Israeli economy, leading to the Israeli economic boom in the 1980s. But when the Intifada happened, Israel realized that those Palestinians cannot be controlled, cannot be broken. And therefore, we need to get rid of the Palestinians. We keep them in these Bantustans, but we cannot rely on their labor, with the ultimate aim of achieving what they call the transfer, essentially the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And the genocide in Gaza was the perfect opportunity for that idea to be revived, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. But it even goes further than that. It's not just only about taking over Palestine, settling Palestine, pushing the population out, but expanding. And not many examples of settler colonialism were expansionist to this degree. They still talk about Sinai being ours, and parts of Syria being ours, and Lebanon, all of it being ours, parts of Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia. So you are talking here about a form of colonialism that borders on imperialism. So it makes Israel kind of the ugliest, most violent, and most ambitious form of settler colonialism, because it goes beyond the national boundaries of this original state that they have captured all these years ago.
Thank you. Roberta, do you have a question by you, please?
Yes, so how we will proceed is I will ask you to raise your hand, just pose your question, and I will take it. Or alternatively, you can come up and talk directly to Ramzy. It's up to you. Do you have any questions in the room? Yes, please.
Roberta, we don't hear.
Yeah, I will repeat it in a second. Sorry.
I want to know what prevents here people from showing that they want.
So the question was, because it was mentioned earlier by Ramzy that we see growing support in European countries, such as Spain, for example, but in Austria, we cannot really see the same, or we cannot say the same. So what does Ramzy think? What do you think, Dr. Baroud, is preventing the Austrian people of doing the same and standing in solidarity?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I did experience that, unfortunately, in Austria, one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited. But I was shocked to see that my lecture that was a few years ago I came to speak was canceled 4 times. And they kept hauling us from one building to the other, from one area to the other, until I think the Arab Center in Vienna kind of decided to hold the meeting in the basement, and people were informed via text. It was very strange. I was bewildered that entire time, trying to understand why Vienna was and Austria was different. And obviously there are some issues here pertaining to the history and the sensitivities of World War II and all of that. But I still think that it's, some of these examples may surprise us in the future. I mean, I've been studying Italy a great deal because of some research I'm doing here in Italy. But, Italy up to a certain point was really almost like Austria. I mean, pro-Palestinian sentiment in Italy was incredible up to the early 90s, when the Second Republic started, and Italy was basically the socialist components. The Communist Party was dismantled, and the socialist components were weakened. The unions that were quite active in mobilizing around global issues of justice and fairness were pushed aside. And then there was a new Italy, a pro-NATO Italy, an expansionist Italy, a colonial discourse Italy, not the Italy of Antonio Gramsci, something entirely different, where Italy became just a vessel for American interests, to the point that sometimes, like when you watch Italian media up to a certain point, this is changing. You would think that there is like a historical conflict between Italy and the Palestinians. All the stereotype, all the hateful, the Zionist language and discourses. You would never see a Palestinian on Italian TV. But then something happened during the genocide. There was a complete flip. Until now, a lot of people trying to understand what has happened. Not only Italy is up in arms in solidarity with Palestine, there is, by the way, there's going to be another general strike in December, and I know that many celebrity activists will be coming, including Greta Berlin, and most likely they are going to have a 1 million person march in Rome, and so forth. But a lot of people still don't fully understand what has happened. Why are the Italians suddenly shifting completely, defying the very media and this fascist government of Meloni, to the point that some people argue that in fact Gaza is going to cost Meloni the next elections? Who would have ever thought that Gaza could become a political factor in Italian politics? So how did this happen? And I would say it happened because of the tenacity of civil society organizations. It happened because of the work of numerous activists. It happens because of the courage of ordinary people. It happened because of the courage of the Palestinians. Believe me, if the Palestinians just played the role of the victim and nothing else, the world would have not stood by the Palestinians with this much determination. But there's a great deal of respect for Palestinians. They don't see them as victims, they see them as something else, as warriors, their children as warriors, their women, their men as warriors. So there's the myth of the Palestinian is happening now in Italy, in Spain, and elsewhere. And we are seeing that kind of influencing mainstream media. People like me are now appearing on Rai TV. Nobody would have asked me before the genocide to speak on mainstream government-funded TV. So let's not despair. Austria is going to have that moment. Many of these countries that are still reluctant, still afraid, they're still worried that they are going to be called this and that. They're still worried that, kind of poking into these historical sensitivities could cost them jobs or reputation or other things. We need to stay the course. Some of the European countries that banned the Palestinian flags in the beginning of the genocide, we've seen that. Now they are the ones where you see nothing but Palestinian flags. It's all about the determination of civil society and ordinary people to keep pushing back. Every day we win an inch, eventually we are going to create that paradigm shift. And I think it's going to happen because it's happening all over the world. And I don't understand why would any single country or entity remain the exception forever.
We have here the same question like in by Roberta. So Roberta, please, another question.
Okay, I will ask the audience again. Any other questions? Yes, please.
How the initial part, and Dr. Baroud spoke about the difference between Israel and other clients. I want to ask something on that the fact that Israel has such a compared to other client states, such a disproportionate influence in the non-political natural sciences, particularly the physical sciences, in technology, and the fact that Israel, particularly the academia and the industry, technological side of the industry is so developed. How does that affect the unequal sort of relationship? How does that make Israel unique among the other client states does Dr. Baroud see the changes with the rise in the academic boycott and the BDS movement?
Would you mind asking the question yourself?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry, I couldn't grasp all of it. Okay, thank you so much for doing it.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Monoshij. I'm a researcher in the University of Vienna here. I wanted to ask Dr. Baroud about what he said in the initial parts regarding that the fact Israel occupies a unique position among the other US client states in the region. I wanted to ask his thoughts on the fact that Israel has such a huge influence in the technology and the natural sciences, particularly through its very successful scientific programs and technological programs and all, how the fact that it affects the special position that Israel has regarding other client states. And the fact that we are seeing a rise in the BDS movement in academia also, does it feel that might affect the uniqueness of Israel as a client state in the future?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I mean, we know that academia has been one of the main contested spaces. Not contested in the same that the pro-Palestine voice registered a great deal within that space, but because Israel and Zionism has always taken it very serious. You have the media, you have academia, and you have the political discourse. And the media, you know, whether news or entertainment or Hollywood or that sort of thing, academia creates the intellectual foundation for society, and the political discourse either imposes its will on both or kind of mitigate kind of a position, you know, in between. Noam Chomsky speaks about this in Manufacturing Consent. Gramsci speaks about it in Cultural Hegemony. Israel has utilized it so very well from the very, very beginning, to the point that when Walid Khalidi, the main Palestinian historian, or the first Palestinian historian in Western academia, you know, the writer of Ma Tabaqqa Lakum, I think, what's the translation? What remains for you, and among other books that spoke about the Nakba and documented the destruction of the Palestinian homeland in 1948. When he went, I believe, to Oxford, and this is a story that was related to me by Ilan Pappé himself, who's a friend of Khalidi, that when he went to do his Ph.D, he was told literally that Palestinians cannot be historians. And it wasn't like they were trying to insult him. They just could not understand. You're a Palestinian and you are trying to be historian. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't work very well. And we are experiencing this right now. I mean, when you kill all these journalists, like 285 now, 286 journalists in Gaza, because according to Israel, every journalist is a terrorist. You know, therefore, Palestinians cannot be journalists. They don't say it in as much of a language or using the exact same words, but essentially that's what they're saying. Not a single journalist that they have killed, they did not dub him a terrorist. So not only they occupy these spaces, but they also push Palestinians out of these spaces altogether. At one point, the only book that was available on Palestine in Italy was The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, the only book. And that was after much struggle and negotiations. Now you have numerous books on Palestine published, and many are coming, to the point that some bookstores here actually have tables that has Palestinian literature. Unheard of. In Seattle, that's my home, I've noticed that phenomenon too. Books on Palestine, special, you know, these tables beautifully decorated with books about Palestine. So now you are beginning to see a Palestinian narrative, but still it's a process of negotiations, because there's a lot of fear. I mean, you see what's happening in the US. There's a war on academia in the US, a war on students, a war on scholars, a war on publishing companies, a war on universities that being defunded, people imprisoned, deported. So they're doing it because they understand how important these spaces are to fundamentally alter the way we think about Israel and Palestine. So even though that we have gained a great deal of space and great deal of you know, margins that we haven't enjoyed before, we know that there's a high price sometimes that comes with it. Academia is going to remain a contested space for a very long time. But I think that there is some shift and some change that is happening in Western academia in particular. And I think this could fundamentally inform the thinking of the young intellectuals and the future, you know, opinion makers in the United States, whether through academia or through media.
Roberta, please, two more questions. The last two questions, and it's by you.
My questions, I think there was, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what he thinks is like stopping Arab countries or even like the Arab diaspora from saying something, especially like with the threat of greater Israel.
So the question here, what does Dr. Ramzy Baroud think? Why are Arab countries not really speaking up, especially with the threat of greater Israel?
Because they can't. I mean, they can't speak up. And this is okay. So we have to distinguish between two things. And I know you've heard this before many times. There's a difference between the Arab people and there's, and Arab governments. And as cliche and repeated as this term is, or this phrase is, it cannot be any truer. Wherever I go to speak, there is always this Arab lady that comes sometimes with her husband, sometimes an Arab man, and they try to communicate. Wallahi, they start crying. Like there's a lady that I met just recently, a Moroccan woman with her daughter, and she stood there trying to ask a question, and she couldn't. She couldn't ask the question. She just said the word Gaza, and she began crying. The depth of the emotions that Arabs have for Palestine, it is something that I would need a whole different lecture to speak about that relationship. But unfortunately, we do not have a mechanism that would allow for this opinion and these emotions and this solidarity to translate to anything politically meaningful. So you have a disconnect. The Arab regimes are not, like the term they are betraying Palestine confuses me a little bit. I used to think this is a betrayal because I was raised in a refugee camp in Gaza, and I worked with this assumption that I was taught to me by my father and by the teacher and by the imam of the mosque that told me that there is a certain mission that Arabs and Muslims should have towards Palestine and the Palestinians. And the fact that they are not fulfilling this mission, it means that they are betraying Palestine. But later on, I began understanding that this is not as simple. Because at the end of the day, you have governments that are behaving not according to betrayal or not, but behaving according to their own interest. Their interest lies with the US. Their interest lies with Israel, unfortunately. They would rather, at one point, they were normalizing, and they continue to normalize with Israel against the Iranian enemy that they perceive to be much greater enemy than Israel itself. So this is not exactly betrayal. These are people who are behaving according to their own perception of self-interest. And because you don't have Arab society with the kind of political agency that is able to force their governments to make a change, nothing happens. Nothing happened. Just recently, there was a mass protest throughout Morocco. The kind of symbolisms and the slogans that they have, some of the most radical voices regarding Palestine and Palestine solidarity come from Morocco. And when they protest, they don't protest in their thousands, sometimes in their millions. But look at what the Moroccan government is doing, like operating in a completely different political field, as if there is absolutely no overlap between the people and the government. So I think we have to be aware of that, so we don't live our, always kind of work with this assumption that it's the matter of the Arabs waking up, the Arabs uniting, the Arabs coming to the rescue. And by the way, the Palestinians themselves are realizing that now, because I've written about Palestinian history from before the Nakba until the genocide, and I always noticed that the popular sentiment in Palestine, the relationship to Arab governments, the whole idea, وين الجيوش العربية, where are the Arab armies, وين الشعوب العربية, where are the Arab people, they stopped. They're not asking for that anymore. Rarely you see that being a defining popular demand. They just want the Arabs to stop conspiring against them. They want the Arabs to stop aiding Israel while Israel is carrying out a genocide. I don't want to enter into this because Hassan already warned me against exceeding my time. But the thing is, the issue of identity is a very complex issue. Identity is not something fixed. At times it changes. At times we see ourselves as Palestinians who are Arabs first and foremost. Sometimes we want to see ourselves as Muslims. And sometimes we want to see ourselves as just part of this global dynamic. Even the press releases and statements made by various groups in Gaza in the beginning used to emphasize the Arab and Muslim element so much. Later on, Ya Ahrar al-Alam, free people of the world. Because they waited for the Arabs for 2 years to come to the rescue. Not a bottle of water was allowed. And as a result, you kind of see there is a shift in the collective awareness of the Palestinian identity. Suddenly, we feel closer to nations that actually stood by us in a real sense. South Africa, Colombia, among others. The Colombian president yesterday in an interview with Al Jazeera declared that Gaza is the capital of resistance of the world. Who said that anywhere in the Middle East? Jordan? Egypt? Who said it? Nobody did. So this is, in my opinion, in the future is going to create kind of a shift in the way that Palestinians perceive themselves and their relationship with their neighbors. And I really do hope, for the sake of the Middle East, or the West Mediterranean, for the sake of that region, I really do hope that we see some galvanization for Gaza, some rupture, some change that will tell us that maybe salvation does not necessarily have to come from South America, maybe from the neighbors, but that moment is yet to happen.
Is there any questions, Roberta, or should we conclude?
Yes, I think you wanted to ask a question. Yeah.
Okay, the last one, please.
Well, where do I have to speak to? Yeah. Are there any similarities between the Zionist colonialism and the Turkish colonialism against the Kurds? There's so many things in common, I think. They have been bombing the villages of the Kurds for about 30 years, and they have killed more than 30,000 people. Half of the people who reportedly have been killed were killed in Gaza. They have chased the population out of the country into Europe and southern Iraq, and they have even managed to get the government of the liberation movement out of the country. I mean, what could they do more? Isn't that aren't those very similar, both colonialisms and fascisms at the order of the Americans?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. I've always argued that when war crimes are normalized anywhere in an area like Gaza, Palestine, it will be normalized everywhere because there is no division. You can't be ethical and moral. And when I say you, I mean the international legal and political system. You cannot be ethical and moral in one area and not ethical and moral in other areas. And unfortunately, I think what's happening in many parts of the Middle East and of course beyond, even in Sudan itself. I mean, the barbarity of what's happening to innocent Sudani men and women and children, this butchery, and the fact that we are kind of following the same established norm now, because nobody did anything about Gaza. Why should they get involved because of fascia or because of anywhere else, whether in Turkey or in Sudan or anywhere else? This is why I do believe that ultimately our battle for, or our fight for justice in Palestine is a representation of a much greater fight for justice throughout the region and throughout the world. Because again, you have the international legal system has failed, and has failed terribly. It did not even reach the minimum standards of what should have happened, and have in fact shielded and defended the war criminals. And I don't see a reason of why they should play a more, a more ethical or politically sound position, whether in Turkey or in Sudan or anywhere else. So I think we have to be aware of that. And sadly, Gaza and Palestine have always been this kind of the lead global example of injustice, where you have all Western powers, colonial, neo-colonial, powers all working together to defeat 2 million people who are being starved to death in the Strip. So don't expect anyone to come to the rescue anywhere else. It has to be something that we as civil society champion and fight for on our own.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for the audience. So before we thank Dr. Baroud, I would like to mention that tomorrow our two guests are journalist and West Asia political affairs expert Aktham Suleiman and journalist Dr. Dieter Reinisch. The title of the lecture is German and Austrian Mass Media as a Colonial Instrument. So we'll focus on Syria and Palestine. This discussion would be in German. And yeah, you can see our program, where is in Café, Culturelle Café. So in the 17th district. Dr. Baroud, would you like, we would like to hear from you some words before we end this fruitful evening. And this evening, like Asmahan has sung once, Layali al-Unsi fi Vienna, Merry Nights in Vienna. You made this evening very beautiful and lightly. Please, the last word for you, and then I will end this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, for your kind invitation, for all the work that you, Roberta, and all of your colleagues have done to make this a success. And also, I'm excited about the future events. I call on people to attend and to be engaged in the conversation. It all starts with conversations like this, and the conversation translates to more discussions and mobilizations and action on the ground. We have to talk to each other to understand one another first before we are able to make a difference in our own societies. So please do attend, please do support the speakers tomorrow and in the following days. And again, thank you very much for doing this and for your courage that you guys continue to speak despite of the numerous obstacles in your way. You will ultimately prevail. I am certain of this.
Thank you, Dr. Baroud, for sharing your knowledge with us today. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your participation and wonderful questions. We truly appreciate your time, engagement. We hope to see you again at our events. Have a great day, and please join me and a round of applause and virtual applause for our distinguished guest, Dr. Ramzy Baroud. Thank you very much.